Hello everybody, let's talk about VRP, or Huawei's Versatile Routing Platform. VRP is the operating system that Huawei has for their network appliances, and it's for all of their network appliances. Even if it's not a router, it still stands for Versatile Routing Platform. It's actually a pretty interesting command line operating system developed for network appliances, as it's got a core operating system with a core set of commands and utilities that will be common across all devices. And then, when Huawei builds the image for a router, for instance, they add the various routing modules and commandlets. The same for the switches, the same for any of their security appliances like their firewalls, and obviously their wireless equipment. So if the device has that capability, like for instance some of their Campus Engine series of switches do have wireless access controllers in it, they will have the wireless LAN commands and modules available to you. Now, the current versions of VRP that are actively in support right now are VRP 5 and VRP 8. 1, 2, and 3, they were discontinued years ago. It's from VRP 1 and 2 where that controversy around Huawei copying Cisco's command line comes from. But since VRP 5 is a brand new OS written from the ground up, at least to my knowledge. But regardless, I'm not really that worried about if they copied or imitated or anything like that, because it's not really going to make much difference to you or me who has to set up Huawei equipment. Now, VRP 5 will be found on the older series of devices, whereas VRP 8 is available on your newer devices and products. But regardless, most of the commands will be the same, but obviously VRP 8 is going to have some extra unique ones that will be available to us. However, if you're using ENSP, like I am, to play around with the Huawei stuff, you're kind of going to be working with VRP 5 only, I'm afraid. Although some of the devices do have VRP 8, it's a very early release and it's nothing like what it is now on the actual equipment. But nonetheless, though, this will get you going. Now, a little bit about the OS and how it handles files before we actually start looking at a bit of the basic commands, because that's probably what you're interested in and what you're here for. So first of all, VRP does handle its files quite well. First up, your system software, which is the VRP image itself, is stored on the device, and it's normally a whatever name.cc. Then you'll have your config files, and your saved configuration files will usually have either a .cfg, .zip, or a .dat file name extension. Although .cfg and zip are more common, zip especially nowadays. Then you'll have your patch files. Your patch files are for minor updates to the current VRP image you're using. If you are going to be doing a large update, usually what you do is you download the newer VRP image for your device that you would have registered with your organization's account and replace the old one with the new one. That's for a larger update though. For smaller updates, it's just a pat file that you're installing. And then you get a path file, which is usually a .bin. And that's normally used to handle device features, or basically it's how the licensing is handled to enable certain features and functions on Huawei devices that do have features unlocked via a license, either features or capabilities. Now, in terms of storage media, you have flash storage internal that you and I can access. That is normally where we'll find the VRP image. It's where our saved configuration file will be. Basically, that's what we can work with. And when present on the Huawei appliance, you also do get an SD card and a USB storage option available to you if the device does have an SD card slot, and obviously same for the USB port, if it's got a USB Type A port for storage. But there's two other types of storage that is only accessible to VRP itself, and that is the NVRAM, or non-volatile random access memory, and the SDRAM. Now, if you're thinking, hang on, what? SDRAM is just normal RAM, synchronous dynamic random access memory. Remember, your network appliances, be them routers, switches, firewalls, whatever, they are essentially a computer that is just highly optimized towards networking activity. So they have processors, they have memory, they have storage, just like a computer. So the big thing that I want to get you comfortable with here is the commands. Because once you get used to the command's structure and behavior and stuff like that, it becomes a lot easier to learn how to configure things like VLANs or routing or whatever it is you're up to. So Huawei's commands are pretty straightforward in their anatomy. Like, for example, what I've got written over here, OSPF1 router ID 1.1.1.1. So you've got your main command. And then, after the command, you may have a keyword that is applied. Now, in this example of creating an OSPF process, that number 1 that follows the OSPF is the process ID, used just to manage the running process of OSPF. Then after that, you would have parameters. And some commands don't need parameters, but a lot of them actually do use parameters. And in this case, the parameter for that command is going to set a ID value that OSPF uses to identify its neighbors. OSPF uses IP addresses to communicate, but a separate router ID to identify its neighbors. Sort of like your phone number versus your name. I don't phone you by your name, and neither do your friends. Although they kind of do, actually, if you think about it, because it's a contact list. But regardless, when they actually do call you, it's a phone number that they're dialing, not your name. Your name just makes it convenient to find it. And then the parameter might have a value. In this case, the actual router ID I want to use, 1.1.1.1. Now, at a later point, I'll probably do a nice video for us on how to set up OSPF with Huawei. But for now, that's just a nice example of a command that does exhibit the command, the keyword, the parameter, and a parameter value. Now, to get comfortable and get going with Huawei's command line, you do need to understand what we call the view levels. So the view levels are going to affect what you can do and what commands are available to you. For now, it's going to seem a little bit pointless and annoying to use them, but the point of them is actually you can apply restrictions so that certain users or support personnel can only access certain views and commands, which is useful for security and separation of control. Separation of duties is the word I was thinking of there. All right, but first up, we start in user view. User view is a fairly minimalist capability. The most exciting things you can do there is changing the date and time, saving your current configuration, and messing around with some startup parameters. But in terms of actually configuring something like an IP address or a VLAN or anything interesting like that you're going to have to step up a level to at least system view. Now, system view is where you start to be able to apply configuration. At system view, you'll be able to configure anything that affects the system globally. Like, for example, changing its name, creating a VLAN if it was a switch, setting a router ID if it was a router, which you actually can do separate to any command. And then, from system view, you can then progress to either protocol view, interface view, or a service view. In protocol view, that's where you go to configure a particular protocol. As with the example I gave for the command anatomy, OSPF would be one of them. If I were to go to an interface view, I'm going to a specific interface on the device and applying a configuration to it, such as an IP address. And with service view, which is what I call it, Huawei actually doesn't have a name for it, but I use service view. It's there to configure particular services. So for instance, if we're looking at wireless LANs and I'm working on a wireless LAN access controller, I go to a WLAN view to configure the WLAN management service. Now, each of these views, protocol, interface, and service view, can potentially have other or sub-views where you go deeper into it. And again, when we get to some videos where we do look at some of these protocols that we can set up, you'll see some of these other views in action. To know which view you're at, just look at your command prompt from your terminal that you're using to access the device's command line. If you see the device's name, which by default is usually Huawei, in a greater than less than symbols, or the left right arrow thingy, that is user view. If you see the device's name with nothing else, in square brackets, you're in system view. If you see square brackets, the device's name, dash, and an interface type and ID number, you are in interface view. And to get from one view to the next, to go from system view to user view, you just literally type system-view in the user view. If you are in system view and you type interface, for example, gigabit Ethernet 0/0/1, you'll be in that particular interface. Fantastic. If you need to go back a view level, you just type quit, and that'll jump you, for example, from interface view back to system view. If you type quit again, you'll go from system view back to user view. But there's a shortcut to get back to user view. If you type return, or you press the control and the Z key, Z for zebra, on your keyboard, that will take you back to user view in one quick go, no matter what view level you're at. If you want to be in a protocol view, you will need to go to a protocol. So for instance, on this router, I went from user view to system view by typing system-view. And then while I was in system view, I use that command that I use to explain the anatomy, OSPF1, router ID 1.1.1.1. That puts me in the OSPF protocol view. But OSPF has subviews. Like for example, here I type area 0, and that puts me in area 0 of OSPF, which is considered one of the other views. Now, a couple useful little tricks in the command line probably wouldn't go amiss. And a lot of the good tricks involve the arrow keys on your keyboard. If you use the left arrow key, that will move your cursor left 1 character on the current line you're typing on. And obviously, if you've gone a little bit left, you can tap the right arrow key to move yourself a little bit right. This is wonderful if you want to correct a mistake or add something into a command that you're halfway through typing or almost finished typing. But my favorites are the up and down arrow keys. With the up arrow key, I can start cycling through the command history. Basically, I can go and find a command I had typed previously and bring it onto the current line that I'm typing. If I went too far, I can always press the down arrow key and move back down a level in the history. What I dig about those two arrows is I could then go and use the left and right arrow key to edit something and make a slight change to a command I might have run somewhere else, which can really be time-saving if you get used to this. Another great trick is the tab key. Similar to any Unix or Linux operating system, if you type enough of the command for the device to know what you're up to, and you press tab, it will auto-complete that command, that parameter, or whatever it is that you were typing at the time. If, however, you have not typed enough for the operating system to know what you're after, but it's able to figure out a short list of possibilities, it'll cycle through every possibility each time you press tab. So if you're in System View and you type IN on most VRP5 devices, you'll normally cycle between Info Center and Interface, because those are the only two things that begin with IN at System View. So tab can be really time-saving as well if you want to type out the commands in full. But you can also just type enough of the command to be recognized. For instance, if you type INT, the only command in System View that begins with INT is Interface. And if you type G, the only type of interface by default on most Huawei routers that are in ENSP that begin with the letter G is Gigabit Ethernet. So you can get a little bit lazy, but do yourself a favor, while you're learning these commands, rather type out the full one or tab it out so that you get used to seeing the full syntax. And if you're planning on doing any of Huawei's exams, I recommend typing out the commands even more, because they do ask a lot of questions about commands, but that's for another video. Now, another very useful trick is the question mark. If you just type the question mark on its own, VRP will show you a list of commands that you can run based on the view level you're at and the level of access you were granted, if you had restrictions applied, and if you're trying to remember the next parameter or the next keyword or the possible values you could use for a parameter after you've typed a command. You can type a question mark and press enter after that command, and what you'll get is a listing of all the things that would go next. And if you do see in the options of the command help, where you type command and press question, the greater than symbol CR less than, that means carriage return or press enter. So basically, if you see that, you could either press enter then, or if it's the only option, you're done with the command, you can press enter. So that's really helpful. Now, let's have a look at a couple basic config commands to get you going. And one of the easy ones to check out is the adjustment of the date and time. Date and time, like I said earlier, is the only thing you can change in user view. So you can type in user view, clock, time zone, and then you choose a time zone name. That is entirely up to you with whatever you want to call your time zone. And then you are going to either be adding or minusing the hours, minutes, and seconds that your time zone is either ahead or behind UTC time. Please be aware, Huawei uses UTC time on their devices, not GMT. GMT only works in 1 hour increments, whereas UTC works in hour, minute, and per second increments. So just make sure you're using the right time zone. Then, to set the date and time, the command is clock, date, time, and then, weirdly enough, you set the time first, so you do hours, minutes, seconds. And then you do the date in the order of years, months, day. And the reason why it's done that way is that is the Asian method of doing a date. The Japanese, Chinese, and a couple of other countries in Far East Asia are very big on doing year, month, day in that order. And actually is a very sensible one if you know how computers store numerical values. And then, if you are in a country where daylight savings time is a thing, you just have to type clock, daylight-saving-time, and press enter. And from the date and time and the time zone, VRP will work out when and by how much to adjust your time for daylight savings. This can obviously be super useful to make sure that things like log messages and error messages, when they're timestamped, are at least timestamped correctly. Then, if you want to change the device's name, because it probably would be helpful if your prompt helped you remember what device you were working on, you just go into System View and you run the command sysname and you type whatever name you want to give your device. I normally encourage that you try and keep the device's name as short and sweet as possible so that it doesn't take up half of the command line prompt and makes your life a living hell when you've got to type a really long command. Next up, if you want to go and set an IP address on an interface, which will be super useful because now you're starting to set up the network for communications, you get into System View, and from System View you type interface, and the type of interface, and the interface ID number. So for instance, what we did earlier was interface gigabit Ethernet, one word, 0/0/1. And once we're under that view, we can just type IP address, and then the actual IP address we want to set on the interface, followed by the subnet mask. The subnet mask can either be written in dotted decimal notation or in CIDR notation. If you write dotted decimal, it'll be like 255.whatever.whatever.whatever. But with CIDR notation, you just write the decimal number. So if, for instance, it was a classful Class C subnet mask, and instead of typing 255.255.255.0, you just type 24 on its own. That is it. The IP address, space, 24, and that'll work. All right, now let's look at maybe doing a bit of remote access, because it's all well and good to set the device up, but maybe you want to sit at a desk, have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever it is that does it for you, and remotely manage this device. In which case, then you would run the command system-view, get into System View, and you run the command user-interface, and then you type VTY, space, number, space, and a second number if you want to. So user-interface VTY, followed by a number. That is setting up what we call the virtual teletype lines, which allows you to either use Telnet or Secure Shell, or either, or both, generally not at the same time though, to remotely access the device. And the numbering thing, you need to do at least number 0. But if you do the second number, what you're doing is you're setting up a range of them. You can go between 0 and 14, which is the maximum you can have, and that would allow up to 15 people to simultaneously access the device remotely. If I type 0 space 3, that would only allow 4 people, line 0, line 1, line 2, and line 3, to remotely access it. I know it's a bit weird, but computers and devices like network appliances start counting from 0. And then once you're under that interface, you can run the command protocol inbound, and you can either say all, which just enables SSH and Telnet, or you could type either SSH or Telnet, your choice. I generally prefer SSH because I do like the better security it has. But while I'm here, it might be a good idea to apply some privileges and restrictions. So, for instance, when I'm under the user interface VTY lines, I could say user privilege, level, and a number. 15 gives you the best level of access, and 0 gives you the worst. If you give somebody user privilege level 0, they'll be able to access user view and run things like ping and trace RT, and that's pretty much it. They can't do much else. Now, if you want to, you can apply a restriction, but otherwise the VTY lines normally do allow a level 15 access. But authentication would be a good idea. Whether you're using Telnet or Secure Shell, having somebody have to put in a password is a very good idea. So the way you do that is you run the command authentication-mode password, you press enter, and then you'll be prompted to put in a password up to 16 characters in length. Make sure you type it right because you're not going to be able to review it later. VRP will store the password as a hash value. Or if you want to get fancy and clever, you can go authentication mode AAA. Now AAA requires a separate setup. You've got to go back to System View and set up a AAA mode. But what you can pull off with that is you can have user-specific usernames and passwords and user privileges. So I can have a user account for each administrator, support technician, or whoever is going to be logging into this device with a differing level of access and obviously a unique password. That would be way better than everybody knowing that this one password is used by everybody. All right. Now, next thing you will probably want to know how to do is how to save your work. So with VRP, you have to go back to user view, and then you run the command save. And it'll prompt you, are you sure you want to save your stuff? You tap Y and you press enter. If you want, you can also save to a different file name other than the default, in which case then you at user view type save, followed by the file name you want to save to, and when prompted you say Y. Please be aware, if you save your current configuration to a different file than the default, you do need to run the command startup, saved-configuration, and the different file name you wanted to save to if you want your device to use that saved config that you just saved to on the next time it boots. Once you've done that, you can just type reboot, and when prompted you say yes, enter to tell it you're sure that you want it to reboot. And the device will reboot and then start using that new saved configuration file, that boot and every boot thereafter to set up the device when it turns on. Now, if you would like to get a free holiday in 2 commands from your workplace, you run the command reset saved-configuration, and when it prompts you, you say Y and you press enter. That will clear the current saved configuration file. And then you type reboot. And if you really want that free holiday where you don't even have to come back to work, You tap N when it prompts you and Y when it prompts you the second time. And what you've done is factory reset the device if you do that. Now, the reason why I say this is your free holiday is because you just wiped your saved configuration file. And by not saving and saying yes to the reboot, you're now not able to recover that config unless you've got it backed up somewhere else. So please read your prompts carefully. When you type reboot, the device will check, is the current configuration which sits in RAM the same as the saved configuration file? If it sees it's the same, it doesn't prompt you. It just says, would you like to reboot, yes or no? But if VRP sees that it's different, it'll say, hey, the saved config and the current config are not the same. Would you like me to save it, yes or no? And you tapped N. And then it says, okay, are you sure you want to reboot? Yes. So yeah, be careful with that combination of commands. I actually forget the reset save configuration command even exists, so that I don't ever actually run it. Then you want to view things. You want to check out your config. You want to check out statuses and stuff like that. Well, the display command has got you covered. We use display for pretty much everything in Huawei for checking out what's going on the devices. So if you're on the command display saved configuration or display current configuration, you will see the saved and current configuration respectively. Please be aware the display command works no matter what view level you're at. You could be in an other view inside a protocol view and still run the command display current config, and it'll show you the config sitting in RAM. But a very cool trick that I love using is when I'm in a particular view, like for instance Gigabit Ethernet 001, and I run the command display this, it shows me that snippet or that piece of the current configuration file that is relevant to that particular thing I'm looking at. So that can be a great way if I want to just check how this thing is set up without having to read through the entire current configuration file that sits in RAM. And then you can also use the display command to check control plane information. The control plane is where your network appliance will keep a lot of its working information in memory. Things like a switch's MAC address table, a router's routing table, anything that is not permanently saved but is part of the device's working behavior will be kept in the control plane. But that's a conversation we're going to have in another video. So to check something, you could say, for instance, display interface brief to see a summary of your interface information. If you're working on a device that takes IP addresses, you can run the command display IP interface brief, and that will show you a summary of all the interfaces and what their IP addresses are. If you are on a router, you could say display IP routing-table and see a routing table. Basically, display is used anytime you want to see what's going on the device, either be it from a configuration perspective or some value that's being used somewhere in the device, like a routing table. So that was a nice little intro to some of the commands. Should be enough to get you going. And remember, I've got that video that shows you how to get your hands on Huawei's course material, which includes their lab guides, so you could check out some of these things in your own time. But don't worry, I've got videos planned for the future that's going to build on this and show you more of what you can do on a Huawei appliance. So, thanks for listening, and hope to see you in the next video.